Last time on This Man's Amazing Life.
Sperm Donor Dad's time-running bars came to an end when he ran cross with a Cuban drug dealer pushing heroin. I don't know what Sperm Donor Dad was thinking. I know he worked as an enforcer from time to time, but he gave this man a beating in front of his clients. First holing up in a penthouse with some acid hippie, a Woodstock hangover on 97th Street. He had a tattoo I always found interesting. It was of his ex-wife crucified with the words, "In love forever." He told me that if he got into a fight and had to use a weapon, he wanted to use one that had another purpose, so you can't be charged with intentional murder. Growing up in New York City is an experience like none other, and I think I should lay some real heavy rap on you brothers and sisters right now. Kids raised in the city are born with hair on their chests, and some even with hair on their teeth. I could see tears flowing down her face. Your Aunt Anne went to heaven. She looked out the window and then said, "The sun shines when people go to heaven." The very first movie I ever saw, believe it or not, was Mad Max. Sperm Donor was having another argument with my mother one night, but he walked out the door with me, and I remember going down the streets excited to be going to see a movie. "What movie are we going to see?" I asked him. "Mad Max," he said. "Why is he mad?" I kept asking.
And now back to your regularly scheduled program.
My Aunt Sheila, if the legend is true, delivered her first child by herself when she was 17 years old, 100 pounds soaking wet, in Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx. She had 3 children named Walter, Leah, and Patricia. Their father was an obsessed Irishman who wanted to go back to Ireland to do his part in the war. Myself and my sister grew up hearing the stories of our cousins who were back in Ireland, that they'd been kidnapped by their father, and that he took them from their apartment in the Bronx in the middle of the night and flew them to Ireland with him. The story goes that he raised them there, but as teenagers they found their way to England. Walter was the first to come back to the United States. He came to New York and enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps, and then reconnected with my family. The first recollection I have of him was he took myself and a friend to see the movie Godzilla. The actual ancient old film had been colorized and was being shown in the theaters in the city. Walter had his standard issue crew cut and walked upright. He was ready to go into the Corps. I remember his white-hot energy was met with a cool, almost psychopathic tone and volume of voice. He spoke so quietly you'd think that he was whispering. In his pants leg that night, he carried a machete. On the bus back from the movie theater, he pushed open one of the windows, climbed out of the back of the bus, and rode on its bumper. He tried to get on top of the bus, but a policeman stopped him and put him back in his seat. He gave us a diatribe about how he knew how to build bombs and had been making them since he was a child. He then went off to the Marine Corps, much to the relief of the New York Transit Authority. Years later, my cousin Leah, and eventually her sister Patricia, would also come back to New York and the States, but just for visits. Walter went to serve under General Norman Schwarzkopf in Desert Storm. He was over there on the Kuwait-Iraq border long before President Bush gave his "This aggression in Kuwait will not be tolerated" speech. Walter sent my mother letters from the front line. He was on it, describing the happenings around him. He said he would dig trenches in the desert and that they were sleeping in body bags in those trenches, which is where he wrote the letters to her from. Whenever my mother received a letter, she'd hold it in the air, announce that she had it, and read it out loud. Those letters kept coming even after the war. The shortest war, I think, in history. And then he was back stateside. He always wrote that the Iraqi soldiers would wave and smile to them the entire time they were digging trenches, and also waved white flags, signifying they intended to surrender. One letter described how a bunch of them walked up to Walter's unit waving white flags and asked for cookies and water. It also said the Iraqis were surrendering even to news crews. They were so desperate to avoid combat. Even back then, people had political opinions about our actions in Iraq. I remember my school teachers were divided on the war. It was ridiculous, and I began to think more of my teachers as crazy people instead of teachers. I had a teacher named Miss Stevens who took her entire third period class out multiple times into the street to protest the war and protest George Bush. And then in fourth period, Mr. Sabula would announce Miss Stevens had violated her duties and explain to us that he felt the war was just and a good thing, and that President Bush was saving all these poor people in Kuwait from being murdered in the streets, and that the Kuwaiti women were being raped in the streets by Iraqi soldiers. I always had this concept that the Iraqi military's main objective was to tie women up to street lamps and rape them, that this is what they did as a military. Eventually, Walter became a corrections officer in Los Angeles and ate his gun. He would go to his grave claiming that the showers in Iraq had something in them that made him sick. But I think it was the pills. He was one of the first people I knew of that had a terrible addiction to prescription drugs. They ate his lunch. Once a brave man, this hero, a justice keeper with a wife and kids, ended his life hooked on these killer drugs prescribed by these killer doctors that know better and don't care. Patricia's story, take it or leave it, is that after taking up with a man she fell in love with in England, fled with him to the Costa del Sol in Spain after he murdered somebody to help him escape extradition. Leah settled down with a man she met and they had a bunch of kids together. They went to live in a cottage in the south of England, and then the kids were raised in France later on, where their father was from. The girls, Leah and Patricia, always had extreme emotional issues, and you had to walk on eggshells with everything you said and did. For my early years, Sperm Donor was my hero. I remember he'd take me with him to work sometimes. He would install and program large voicemail systems in the office buildings, the skyscrapers of New York. He took me with him to the World Trade Center a few times on weekends when the employees were away from work. I'd run through the floors we were on and look out and see the view. You could see Philadelphia from a clear day if you knew what to look for. Sperm Donor told me that when the Trade Center was built, he and my uncle were friends with the fire inspectors, and that the inspector tasked with green flagging the buildings as safe against fire refused to do it. The story goes, and I guess this can be verified someplace, is that the inspector, the chief in charge, was a fill-in, a deputized chief for the big boss who was on vacation. According to the story, the deputy looked at the architects and businessmen who built the Trade Center and said, "This building is not safe," and refused to sign the CFOs, or the occupancy certificates, and the head chief, who was on vacation, had to be brought back to New York to sign off on the buildings as safe so they could open the doors. Sperm Donor also said that before the doors were opened, all the phone cables had to be redone. He claimed that when the local 3 Teamsters, the electrical workers, installed the phone cables, that the developers, rather naively, made it known that they had no interest in union workers as a permanent fixture repairing cables. The legend is the union workers on the last day of work brought 2 gallons of paint in each of their tool bags and poured them down the chutes that housed the cables, cut cables on the way down, and disabled the entire phone system in the Trade Center. And the developers, at a loss for labor under deadline to start moving tenants in, had to rehire the Teamsters at an outrageous price to put a second new set of cables in the building. The Teamsters eventually wound up getting the contract to service the phones, which they did until the day those towers fell. When the first bomb went off in the Trade Center, Sperm Donor Dad was in there working on something in one of the towers, and he spoke about being up in the tower and the bomb causing it to sway from side to side. He explained that the Trade Center was built on 4 giant springs under each tower that were meant to stabilize the towers should an earthquake hit. My mother, too, worked in the Trade Center from time to time, trimming and watering the plants in the offices. She'd call us every time she got to work. We were always home alone, and in fact, I was a latchkey kid for years and years that way. But she'd call us and say what she was seeing. The job, she truly hated it. I remember she'd come home with her nails with dirt under them and hands swollen and in pain. She worked on her knees a lot doing that, and when she got home, she really couldn't walk too much with her illness and all. My mother would play Elvis records all the time, and I loved Elvis. One Sperm Donor got hired to work at RCA Records, Elvis's record label, and he took me with him. His job was important because if these phone systems did not work, the company did not work either. A person working at RCA took me all around their New York offices and showed me a bunch of pictures of Elvis in gold frames with reproduction gold records. When I got back to the phone room where all the modems and boards were set up, a million little wires running everywhere, a man came in and asked if I liked Elvis. I said, of course I did. And he looked at the woman who took me around and told her to go to some floor and see if they had an RCA press kit for the king lying around someplace. As we were getting ready to leave, the woman and the man returned with a banker's box filled with cassette tapes and pictures and printed materials. They gave me a press kit that had every single one of his albums on RCA, all cassettes, press releases about the albums, and all sorts of novelties like trading cards and pins, stuff like that. The documentation was in a big red and black folder, and when I opened it up, there was an 8x10 photograph of a young Elvis. Autographed. Legitimate. It was a great day. I love going to work with Sperm Donor because we'd leave the house early in the morning and walk through the streets when the sewer creatures were still meandering about, as he would say. Sperm Donor, in my eyes, and also in the eyes of many, was a tough man who earned his reputation as a bouncer and a bodyguard for punk rockers like Johnny Thunder and Sid Vicious. So I felt completely safe with him at 4:30 in the morning, running to catch up with him on our way to one of these giant glass towers to fix the phone systems. He also seemed to know a story about every building, what company was housed in it, who built it, and the hotels as well. He had a bizarre knack for knowing the spots where people were murdered. Remember, this is years before the internet became accessible to everybody. My favorite part of the morning was going to the big coffee carts that were on every corner, and he'd take out a $5 bill and buy me an orange juice and a giant, I mean as big as my head, glazed donut, and he'd get one for himself and a large coffee. He'd tell me that the city wanted to get rid of the carts, and it pissed him off because where else could you get a coffee and a donut for 75 cents? He said the big corporations and private money were in a conspiracy to get rid of the mom and pop setups and make everybody pay $5 instead for breakfast. Yeah, he had his quirks. He also had a really strange habit of telling off homeless people who hit him up for change when he was with me, and who knows, maybe he did this when I wasn't around too. I remember the homeless had all these stupid lines they'd use to try and get you to give them money. They'd say things like, "What, no donut for me, your other son?" and "Big man, small change." One guy my father lost it completely over. This man walked up to us one morning and said, "Big man." Everybody called my dad Big Man or Tall Guy. This guy said, "Big man, you're a good father. Have you ever considered adopting a black man?" This just drove Sperm Donor through the roof. But this bad habit he had was, instead of just saying, "Sorry, I can't," or even, "No, sorry, brother," he just yell at these guys, and the women too, telling them they were bums and to go and get a job. I'm surprised nobody ever took it up with him. I mean, he was big. He was a massive man in his day, but a lot of these homeless guys were tweaked out on PCP and angel dust and felt no pain and were big badasses themselves. The homeless were always a fixture in New York. I remember this one woman. She had to be about 80 years old, early one morning, running through Columbus Circle barefoot in just a pink dress, and people saw her as she ran toward them and they'd jump away. She took sight of us as we walked alongside the old New York Coliseum, an abandoned arena that was torn down years later, and she ran up to us, and she was growling, and in her mouth was a dead sewer rat. Sperm Donor put me behind his leg and stared her down. She put her hand out for money and just went, "Arr! Arr!" with the rat in her mouth to Sperm Donor, who looked down at her and said, "Enjoying your breakfast?" and walked around her. I was holding on to him by his leg, standing on his size 15 shoe. He regularly walked around with me that way. One day I'll never forget. It was beating down hot in New York. I mean 100 degrees, and in the subways, and even still to this day in these stations, it feels like 140 degrees. Sperm Donor took me with him working, and we wound up in Grand Central Station as the first wave of commuters began to pile through the terminal. They had big banks of payphones in the middle of Grand Central, and people would line up to use these phones. Sperm Donor put me on the steps where I could see him and told me to stay and keep an eye on him, and he walked up to the phone banks and began to call the switchboard at his job and get the day's assignments. People began to line up for their turn to make a call, and this scraggly, scrawny, and dirty guy, I remember his blue jeans were brown with dirt, stood behind Sperm Donor. As Sperm Donor began to get the appointments, this guy started looking around to see if anybody was noticing him. Then he began to slide his hand into Sperm Donor's back pocket. He was picking his pocket and having a difficult time at it as well. Sperm Donor said, as if he were a blue-blooded patrician asking for Grey Poupon to the secretary, "Would you please excuse me a moment? Some bum is trying to pick my pocket," and in one quick motion, hit the guy with the end of the phone's receiver on his forehead, splitting it clear down the middle. I remember the look on this man's face when he heard the words, "Some bum is trying to pick my pocket," and Sperm Donor, a good foot taller and 100 pounds heavier than him, began to turn around. The little guy froze and had a look like he just saw the Grim Reaper come knocking, which is funny because Sperm Donor had the Grim Reaper tatted on him someplace as it was. The man went down hard, I mean like a shot, and I recall what I saw. As he was falling, blood squirted up from his forehead and people stepped back. The back of his head slapped to the marble floor with a sound I can still hear today, splat. Then the blood began. It started to fill up underneath his shoulders and created a pool under his torso. A woman screamed, "Jesus Christ!" as if she were more annoyed by having to step aside than worried about what was happening to the man. Sperm Donor turned around, took out a handkerchief, and wiped the blood off of the receiver and continued his call, asking for the addresses of the buildings to go work in. New Yorkers, cold as ice, just walked around this guy. I was a little shaken and wanted to say something. I was afraid that the guy would die and Sperm Donor would go to prison. Then 2 police officers began to walk up to the scene. They were very slow about it, as if they didn't really want to be there, and before saying anything, just looked at each other like, what should we do? Now, here's the interesting impression I had at that moment. All of my worries subsided when I saw the cops, because for ages Sperm Donor was making statements about the police department rescinding the rules for being a cop, that once upon a time cops had to be 6 feet tall with a certain percentage of body fat versus muscle to join the force and commanded respect, etc., etc. And then they started letting women and short fat guys onto the force and they're a joke and so on. So when I saw these 2 very small cops come upon Sperm Donor, I actually thought everything would be all right, that he'd simply beat these 2 guys to death and nobody was getting arrested because he was a badass. I know, what a thought for a small child to have, but that's the New York life. That's how it goes. One of the officers walked up and, I mean with trepidation, tapped Sperm Donor on his back, who shot his head around and said in an angry tone, "That bum tried to pick my pocket. Can't you see I'm busy? Now I need to finish this call for work, and I have my son with me." He pointed to me. The cop, when Sperm Donor turned around, looked up at him and stepped 2 paces back. I knew he was getting off, and he did too. He just turned his head and said into the receiver, "2 cops are here asking what happened to this bum." "Yeah, I'm fine. The boy is too." The cops looked at me, then gave each other another perplexed look. And I found it funny, almost like a scene from a movie or a piece of furniture going down a conveyor belt. The 2 cops each grabbed one of this man's arms and dragged him away from the scene of the incident like nothing happened. And nothing ever happened to Sperm Donor. He finished his call. He took a few minutes, too, and came over to me and took me by the hand. He walked me out of Grand Central Station and said, "That bum was trying to pick my pocket. I want you to understand what I did was in self-defense. I'm within my rights to do that." "What are rights?" I asked. "You learn about them as you grow up. and you'll also be uglier than me. I only recall Sperm Donor hitting me one time in my whole life. When I was about 8 years old, I was very upset over something. He may have punished me, like I had to sit at a table and be quiet for an hour instead of watching a TV show, something like that. I was having a tantrum and he was making a phone call. I wouldn't relent, and he stood up, phone in his left hand, and said, "I told you to quiet down," and lifted me by my pants, flung me in the air, and with the same hand he lifted me with, swatted me on the back, the smack changing my direction in the air, and I landed on his giant mattress. I was so in shock by the whole thing that I quieted down and remained quiet for quite some time after that. The arguing between Mom and Sperm Donor began to grow. My mother was particularly cantankerous, loud, and belligerent for her part. It's almost as if she was challenging Sperm Donor to do a number on her in front of the kids. She had a lot of crazy friends, a lot of them lesbians that hated men as it was, and her life was very difficult to come to terms with. One day a phone call came in that gave my mother pause. She handed Sperm Donor the line, and he was equally demure. I later found out that Sperm Donor had a woman he was married to in Florida who had died right around this time. My mother began to cook dinner that night, and the more she cooked, the angrier and angrier she got, smashing dishes and cursing to herself about Sperm Donor. Myself and my little sister, who was still in a high chair, began to become hungry and impatient, and we started banging on the table. Usually this would draw a stern look from Sperm Donor and we'd stop, but this night he didn't seem to mind. The tension between him and Mom got heavier and heavier, and he went into the kitchen and quietly spoke to her. My mother did the number one thing that women do to piss men off, that being she immediately announced to him she was going out that night. This was her jab. What she didn't expect was my reaction to this. Every night of my life up until this point, my mother put me to bed, kissed me goodnight, sat next to me when I was sick, read me a book, and told me a story. I began to beg her please not to go out, but she slammed the kitchen door shut. Sperm Donor actually kept his cool the entire time. He came back into the main room and set the table, just 3 places, minus one for Mom, who was going out. I asked why Mom was going out and if she was coming back, and he just said she's going to see her friends. I was scared. I told him it's dark outside, that she could get robbed. She'd been robbed before in the neighborhood, and the guys who robbed her hurt her neck ripping the purse off of her. Sperm Donor really didn't have an answer for this, so he just said, she'll be all right. Mom came out and served us dinner and gave me a kiss on the cheek, something she rarely ever did. I'll never forget it. Her long flowing hair, black Irish afro almost, pressed up against my face, and she said, "I'll be back later." She was wearing boots and put on her camouflage green jacket and walked out of the house. Sperm Donor was about himself in a way that I'd never seen before. He was not this big badass and giant like he'd always been. He sat in a chair lower than my sister's high chair and was spoon-feeding the baby and looked distant. He made almost no eye contact throughout dinner. The minutes Mom was gone turned into hours, and I was fixated on the front door of the apartment. She was gone for so long that I thought she might not come back or that something had happened. Just when panic really set in, I could hear her keys at the door, and she entered. Except something was different. That long flowing hair of hers, her trademark, was gone. She'd shaved her head into a crew cut. She looked at me and brushed her hand through her crew cut and said, "What do you think?" I began to cry. I was so upset. Bet that wasn't the reaction she expected. Going to public school in New York was just as much of a task as actually doing the classes. For elementary school, my parents enrolled me in a giant public school in a good neighborhood called PS 158. Yes, New York had hundreds of public schools. This was number 158. I had a relative who lived in the district, the Upper East Side, so they used her address and told me if anybody asks where I live, that I live somewhere there in some apartment building a few blocks away. The experience of going to school in New York was really, truly like going to a big event at an arena every day at the crack of dawn, a rock concert or something. Real Planet New York stuff. The school was packed to the max, and unlike the other schools I'd eventually wind up in, of maybe 1,500 students, you could count all of the black kids on one hand and still not get to 5. Every morning my mother would drive me in her beat-up AMC Concorde. No power steering. The muffler just fell out one day and was never replaced. That car would inch by inch make its way through the city traffic for about an hour every morning. Sometimes we'd eat breakfast in the car and do the homework we had put off the night before. When you'd finally get to the school, a 6-story building that held about 15 classrooms on each floor, you were instructed by a police unit that existed only for the public schools, the school safety cops, to enter a large concrete-only courtyard closed off by a giant fence. Each class had its own general area of the courtyard. The kids would mingle, and then the first whistle would blow, and you had to go to your classes. And you had to go to the spot for your class, line up shortest in front to tallest in back, and your teacher would come out with a clipboard and check off who in their class was present. Then we'd all sing the school song. It went, P.S., P.S. 158, P.S., we really think you're great. We love you. There's none above you. So we are singing this out loud and clear. Then the principal, a politically connected woman named Miss Cohen, would order the classes in one at a time through 4 doors that led to 4 stairway banks to the floors where the classrooms were. It was pretty basic. The first floor, which sat above the ground floor, had the kindergarten and first grade classes. The second floor had the second grade classes. The third floor, the third grade, and so on until grade 6. When you got to your classroom, you'd put your books in your desk and wait to say the Pledge of Allegiance. We'd stand up, put our hands over our hearts, and recite the pledge every morning to an American flag inside the classroom. We always ended the pledge with one nation, indivisible, under God, with liberty and justice for all. I never saw one computer in the school. Sperm Donor Dad had a heated conversation one evening with my mother about the school. I guess a report had been made about me, and the principal's office called my mother, and they had her sign a card that essentially confessed I had done whatever it was they felt was an infraction. Sperm Donor was upset because, as he said, the schools make these records and it goes on his permanent record. It's just like a police report. These directors and supervisors are all shills for the government. At the time, professional wrestling was becoming a phenomenon in the United States. The wrestlers were giant celebrities and really became superheroes that had actual people portraying them. Every American boy wanted to be G.I. Joe. Now they wanted to be Hulk Hogan or Bob Backlund or Jimmy Superfly Snuka. WrestleMania fever had infected the school too. And wrestling was more important to the boys in the school than any class, that's for sure. Every morning in the courtyard before class began for about an hour, the kids would wrestle. Yes, wrestle. And I mean do body slams and suplexes and elbow drops on the concrete ground in the courtyard and portray their favorite wrestlers. We actually did this, rain, sleet, and snow. We'd hit each other with big icicles in the winter. It was amazing that nobody got killed and that there were not more serious injuries, although one kid broke his neck taking a dreaded camel clutch from a hyperactive kid. A friend of mine who was so hyperactive and would breathe so heavy that he'd stop formulating words and just make grunting noises. This was the cue to stand away from him because the excitement would make him puke after a few minutes. One day this boy, let's call him John, challenged a kid to a wrestling match in a far-off back corner of the courtyard that had a large storm drain 4 or 5 feet into the basement under a large metal grate. The grate was in the ground and about 4 by 8 feet. We called it the steel cage. Every now and again, the same teacher, a man with glasses, would come over and tell us to stop wrestling there, and for some reason he felt the bare concrete ground was better for us to throw each other on. That day, John got the camel clutch on this kid, a good-sized boy already sporting a cast on his arm because he broke at wrestling the week prior. And when John pulled back, the end of the steel grate collapsed into the ground, sending the boys down the storm drain and breaking this poor kid's neck. You'd think that after that, wrestling would have stopped in the courtyard, but it didn't. I remember the same kid, pseudonym John, getting into a real wrestling match with me. What I mean is, we would normally just wrestle until somebody gave up or got pinned, yes, on concrete, but sometimes kids would have disagreements about things, like kids do, and would try to settle their score on the concrete and throw a fist or apply a nerve hold and go at it for real. I don't remember what started the beef between us that morning or who won, but we'd started wrestling and I was portraying Rowdy Roddy Piper. He was Superfly Snuka, and we wound up rolling on the concrete in a legitimate wrestling match for a good half hour. Cuts, bruises, and we bit each other, tried to gouge each other's eyes out, and at one point, pseudonym John just stood up. He was on top of me, and I bit him on the side of his stomach, making him scream in pain. And looking at my teeth marks having punctured his baby fat, he calmly said, "We shouldn't be doing this." I agreed. We sat against a wall, caught our breath. Some older girls looked at us laughing, and he said, "Let's ask our parents for a play date. We can wrestle at my house." I like to portray Rowdy Roddy Piper, who was beginning to become a huge celebrity. I'd leg sweep a kid and say Roddy's lines, whatever I saw on TV. Things like, "Just when you think you've got all the answers, I change the questions," or "Don't throw rocks at a man with a machine gun." And I'd spit on my opponents just like Hot Rod, as they called him, did. Everybody wanted to be Hulk Hogan. So if you wanted to have a wrestling match in the courtyard and portray Hulk Hogan, you'd be waiting all day because everybody wanted to play him. So if you wanted to get this energy you had out of you, usually you had to be one of the bad guys and hope the kid playing Hulk Hogan didn't kill you for spitting on him. Turns out that Hulk Hogan had a connection to the school's principal and actually showed up and met the kids one day. I guess he lived in Connecticut and his wife and the principal were friendly neighbors. I'll never forget how every adult was going completely bonkers around him the entire time he was there, and how the Hulkster was the calmest person one could be, and took the time to sign autographs for every single child. Now, when I went to get his autograph, I sized him up. I was fairly certain that Sperm Donor Dad was about the same size as the Hulkster, at least height-wise. One day, my mother brought me into the living room and said, "Your father and I are getting divorced. You get to have 2 apartments now." Then she asked me how I felt about it. Honestly, I felt just fine with the whole thing. I knew what a divorce was. I had classmates with divorced parents. I was just a second grader, and I told my mother it was for the best. I kid you not, that's basically what I said. It's better that way. My mother just shook her head like, "Who is this kid?" Sperm Donor then sat me down and said, "Your mother and I are getting divorced." I told him I knew about it. "What? Why'd she tell you?" he began, but then went straight into his speech about how this didn't mean he did not love me anymore, and I'd still be seeing him all the time, and he was going to be living just a few blocks away. After that, I never saw him sleep in the apartment again. It was like he went someplace that night. It was right around this time that Sperm Donor Dad started taking me to wrestling matches at Madison Square Garden. By and far, this was the greatest part of my childhood. Wrestling was such a big deal, and yes, it was the hottest ticket in town. They were impossible to get, and Sperm Donor knew people through his union that were able to get him fairly good seats for every show. Every few weeks, the WWF, the biggest wrestling company in the world, would come to Madison Square Garden. Danny DeVito, Andy Warhol, Yoko Ono even attended the wrestling matches. Mr. T started to wrestle, Muhammad Ali refereed matches, and of course, the rock and roll celebrities, Cyndi Lauper most notably, and the kids that played in the Goonies, all got in on the act. And I was the only kid in school that went to every single show at Madison Square Garden. The kids began to call me Mr. Wrestling, and the day after every single event, I'd be surrounded and mugged with questions about Hulk Hogan. Did he body slam the guy he fought? And what happened with this match or that match? Needless to say, this was a big part of my social life. Things went bad at home. Sperm donor moving out was problematic for me. Mom was raising us by herself 5 days a week while he worked. But going to wrestling at Madison Square Garden with him made all the stresses seem insignificant. We had a routine. On the day of the matches, he'd make sure to get off work a little early and come and pick me up at 6 p.m. on the dot at the door of my mother's apartment. Leading up to the show, I'd count the days for weeks until the big day came. The night before, I could never sleep. I'd be so excited thinking about what was going to happen the next night, who was wrestling, the storylines, what would the steel cage match be like, or what about the Texas death match, or would the championship be lost or successfully defended? The day of the show, I would count the hours and the minutes until school let out. Back then, it was safe for your kids to go home by themselves after school. You just had to teach them to look both ways before crossing the streets and not to talk to strangers. I would run. Run like a track star home and shoot into the apartment. I wouldn't even pick up the mail that was left in front of the door sometimes. I would change my clothes and sit on the couch facing the front door, and when it got close to 6, I'd put on my coat and listen for footsteps. And then he'd approach. Before he could even get up the stairs, I'd shoot out of the door and say, "Let's go to wrestling!" And he'd smile and take my hand and walk me out. We'd ride the subway to Madison Square Garden. Sperm donor like taking the local line. It's just 5 minutes more of your life and you get to sit down, but I didn't want to hear it on wrestling night. I wanted to get to the garden and fast. We always took the express. Every time we went to the garden, before we went into the place, he would take me across the street from the main entrance to Roy Rogers Restaurant, a fast food chain. I love the idea that you got to pick the burger you wanted from the counter and the basket of fries that you wanted and fill the soda yourself with the soda machine. And I loved the burgers from there. We would sit always on the second floor and watch as people began to go into Madison Square Garden to see the matches. I would always ask him about the seats, and he would pull out a photocopied paper that had a layout of the seating charts for wrestling at the Garden. He'd take one of his work pens and make a star in the section where he'd be sitting that night. It didn't matter where the seats were. I always found something to like about where we were sitting. We never had nosebleeds. Then we'd cross the street and go into the Garden. The ushers would check your ticket and you'd go either right or left and get on these escalators that led to each level. We always wound up there about an hour before showtime. To me, it felt like 5 minutes. Then Howard Finkel, the ring announcer, would come to the ring and make the introductions. I don't think that even one time he was not the ring announcer. The most poignant memories I have, the ones that stick out the most, are firstly, watching Andre the Giant come to the ring in front of 15 to 20,000 people was a true sight to see. This man walked through a crowd of thousands, and if you looked into the audience, the first thing that ever caught your eye was how much bigger he was than every single person in the building. He stood out as 1.5 feet taller than anybody in the sea of thousands. With the exception of a man I knew years ago who was 7'5" and 550 pounds named Jakova, Andre the Giant was the largest man I ever saw in New York City. Another memory I have from the Garden was the night Kamala, the man they called the Ugandan headhunter, debuted. Sperm Donor was not too impressed with him. Sperm Donor was, he used the term that he, quote, tolerated, unquote, black people. So here comes the Ugandan headhunter with the moon and stars painted on his stomach and 400 pounds with a handler and a zookeeper's outfit and a giant wooden African head mask and a spear. Shades of Vince McMahon, the eccentric wrestling promoter who created every character. And Sperm Donor turns to me and says, "Uganda. Yeah, right. Vince McMahon probably found this guy on 125th Street and said, 'Hey man, you want to wrestle?'" I always found that humorous. I remember Sperm Donor, who was significantly bigger than Greg the Hammer Valentine, nonetheless, would always say about the bleach blonde Intercontinental Champion, "Look at the hands on that guy. This guy is the real deal. I'd hate to run into him in a dark alleyway one night." He told me many times when Greg performed that the smallest guys are usually the toughest and the meanest in a fight. The most dangerous man that he ever knew was a bouncer at Irving Plaza who was 5'7" and 120 pounds. I remember watching another Intercontinental Champion, Ken Patera, an Olympic strongman, walk to the ring one night and a fan grabbed his rhinestone-studded ring robe. Patera, without even turning his head, jabbed the guy with a right hand from hell with a stone-like fist. The man flew back through the aisleway about 10 feet and the entire garden cheered. Years later, I met Ken Patera in, of all places, a vitamin shop in Kearney, New Jersey. He'd been in prison, he was out and trying to make a comeback, and I still had the memories of him being loud and mean as a heel, and the picture in my mind of this man flying down the aisle after Patera hit him, knocking him out. I was still young, and nervously I approached Patera and asked for his autograph. He couldn't have been a nicer, kinder person. The man was a first-class act. He gave me an autograph, and I had a little 110 camera, and he took a picture with me, which I still have somewhere today. I'll never forget it. Another wrestler I saw have an encounter with a fan was Jim the Anvil Neidhart, a former linebacker who weighed about 275 pounds legit and had shoulders like a Mack truck. He had a late match one night in the Garden from the east side of the arena as the Anvil was leaving the ring. It was like I was watching this all unfold by myself on a movie screen. The Garden was quiet. Neidhart didn't have too good a match, and as he walked around the ring, this young white guy, about 20 years old, muscles and jeans, came running down the arena floor, and he grabbed his back pocket. He had a large knife. That's when I knew this wasn't part of the show. I couldn't believe it. Am I the only person seeing this, I thought? The man leaped over the barricades around the ring, but he didn't take his knife out. Instead, he pushed Neidhart, who stumbled 2 feet forward but didn't fall. Neidhart immediately turned around and snarled and went after the man. The man put his hands up, yelled, "Sorry, just joking," and ran and jumped back over the guardrail. The cops grabbed him, but they didn't throw him out of the building. They just put him in his seat and said, "Don't do that again." It was a different time, I guess. Sperm Donor never yelled and screamed for any of the matches. He would watch Hulk Hogan perform even, and only as much as let out a grin from ear to ear. He never talked about the matches as anything more than great entertainment, or that was fun, or that was great. One night in the Garden, as we waited for the show to begin, I asked Sperm Donor why he never cheered or booed the wrestlers. His answer stuck with me forever and a day. He said, "You know the matches are predetermined, but make no mistake about it, these guys are athletes, and this stuff hurts. These guys do this 300 nights a year. I've heard of football players that wanted to be wrestlers and quit after one match. I enjoy the entertainment," he said. "This is a good show, so I enjoy the show without participating, but you should know, all of these holds these guys can apply for real, and they are all dangerous moves. To do this, to be a wrestler, you're putting your life in the hands of your opponent every single night and trusting he won't do you in. So make no mistake about it, I respect these guys. They're athletes, and this is a tough business." He had his favorite performers. He loved the Hulkster. He thought the guy was great, and he loved Jesse Ventura, and especially he loved watching Jake the Snake Roberts perform. He'd say, "That guy has more going on upstairs than most people. There's something to him." Sperm Donor would critique some of the guys too, and I loved listening to him talk about the matches in the ring. He would state who were the guys he thought he could take in a fight in the streets, and also who he felt were tougher than him. For some reason, he thought he could take Big John Studd out to the shed if he had to. The odd thing about this was that he and Studd looked eerily alike. Studd was much taller and much wider, but for a period of time, Sperm Donor looked enough like him that once or twice wrestling fans in the Garden came up and asked him for an autograph, thinking he was John Studd. Sperm Donor... so fucking crazy. Oh my God. Hacksaw Jim Duggan was a wrestler who carried a 2x4 board with him to the ring. He did gross stuff in the ring from time to time, usually by accident. People loved him, and Sperm Donor thought he was a spectacle. One night he rolled his head under the bottom rope and puked. The entire Garden went, ooh. Funny stuff. Another time he bled, and Sperm Donor always said the blood was real, and it was. Now Duggan's marching around the ring, blood flowing down his face, and he takes his hand and runs it down his face and licks his blood off his hand and puts his thumb in the air. Sperm Donor said he licks his own blood? This guy's not playing with a full deck. Sperm Donor liked George the Animal Steele, a wrestler with a green tongue that would rip open the pads in the ring corners and eat the stuffing in them. Steele was a performer, and I remember his character was essentially he was a boy raised by wolves and didn't speak any language and was a Neanderthal. Sperm Donor, I guess, knew somebody who knew him, and he would say, you know, this guy's actually a professor. And he wasn't being glib. The man was, in fact, a professor. One night, Steele was in a 6-man tag match and got a chair and chased everybody out of the ring. As he stood in the ring with Dick Kroll, a tall and very notable referee, and a friend of my uncle growing up, Steele hit the referee with the chair, and so ended that night at the Garden, with the referee face down, out cold, in the middle of the ring. Steele had a match with the aforementioned Kamala one night. They called it the Jungle Match. That was when you knew you were in New York City. New Yorkers love this stuff. Here are two guys that really didn't wrestle, a 400-pound African headhunter and his handler in a zookeeper suit, and his manager, a man called the Wizard, who looked like every other homeless guy preaching God and 12-step programs in Brooklyn, against a guy who thinks he's a monkey with a green tongue. The Garden almost blew the roof off itself with cheers when Steele took off his shirt and got pissed enough to fight Kamala. The crowd loved this, and Sperm Donor turned to me and said, "You see this every night on 8th Avenue. Barefooted African warriors fighting with people who think they're house pets. Nothing new here." This was when I got it. Wrestling was about showmanship. It was about entertaining people. I loved it. There was no better form of entertainment anywhere. Superstar Billy Graham was one of my favorites. He'd retired and was now announcing a comeback. There were beta videos of him out there, and I had a few. I loved the way he spoke. He was so cool. "I'm the man of the hour, the man with the power. See that man in the front row with the camera? He came from Tokyo, Japan, just to take my picture." There was a diner in the neighborhood that had a picture of the superstar behind the counter flexing his muscles in Times Square. I loved his rapper, the way he spoke. "I'm eating T-bone steaks, lifting barbell plates. Baby, I'm even getting sweeter than a triple chocolate cake." Man, he was cool. He'd wear feathers in his bandanas and turquoise jewelry signifying he was part Native American. One day on our way to Madison Square Garden, we broke our routine of Roy Rogers, the only time we ever did, and went to Howard Johnson's restaurant in the middle of Times Square. We sat at the counter. I always sat at the counter with Sperm Donor, and I ordered a cheeseburger and fries and a soda. The waitress was doing this chop chop honey thing with Sperm Donor, giving him a look like, "Hurry up and order already." As we ate, Sperm Donor turned me around on the seat to face him. He said, "Who's your favorite wrestler?" "Hulk Hogan," I said. "Yeah, well, how about number 2? I thought. "Superstar Billy Graham," I replied. "Want to meet him?" he asked. "Sure," I said. He turned me around in the seat. And in a blue tie-dyed tank top, the man wore gold clip-on earrings with tassels, and his arms really looked like pythons, was the man of the hour and the man with the power, the superstar Billy Graham. He was leaning over a table and being coy with a waitress who was flush pink in her cheeks and going for his rap. He wrote something on a check and handed her a $10 tip, a huge tip at the time, and she stuffed it in her bra, giving him a flirtatious look. "Hey, you're Superstar Graham," I said. "Yes, I'm the superstar," he said like he was answering a phone call. Wide-eyed, I put my hand out to shake his, like, "Thanks for all you do to make the world a better place" stuff. I mean, he was a superhero come to life. He shook my hand and I said, "Can I have your autograph?" He said, "No problem, little brother, but I have to make it quick. I gotta get to the garden." He signed a napkin for me, and he wrote his name, Billy the Super, and next to it drew a star. He said thank you, and when he walked into Times Square, the people stopped and cheered him on. He was the man of the hour. As usual, I counted the days and the hours until the show at the Garden. That afternoon, I shot out of school like a bullet. I used the back door because it sat on the southern end of the school, which was closer to where I lived than the front door. I ran home with my book bag and its books that felt like bricks bouncing up and down on my back. My breathing was heavy. When I got home, I put on the TV. It was 4 p.m. and world-class wrestling from Texas was on. But I was disinterested because I was about to go see the greatest show on earth, the World Wrestling Federation at Madison Square Garden. The world-class wrestling program ended about 5:30 and I was dressed and ready to go. When 5:45 came, I put on my jacket and my shoes. Then a sound at the door. It was Mom and my little sister. I sat on the couch transfixed on the door. 5:50. 5:55. Any second now, Sperm Donor's big size 15 would thud its way down the hall and I'd jump out. I heard the hallway door. I ran to it. But it was a neighbor. 6 p.m. He was probably coming down the block right now. Any moment he'd be there. Then 6 p.m. turned to 6:05. Then 6:15. "Where is he? We have to get to Madison Square Garden," I said to Mom. "He's probably on the train," she said. At 6:30, we paged him on the switchboard at work. My mother said, "Tell him to call his son at home. He's waiting for him." The beads of sweat began to slide down my face. My mother had a concerned look to her. She crossed her arms. She was agitated at Sperm Donor. No return call. It was 6:45. Then 6:50. Then the clock struck 7. "Let's go to his house," I asked Mom. But the phone rang. She was next to it and answered. "Where are you?" "He's dressed and ready." Then she cursed him. She hung the phone down and looked at me. Walked in and stood over me. "Your father's not picking you up tonight. He has to work." I called and called and called him past the 8 p.m. opening bell time. He answered once. He wasn't working. He was home. And after telling me, "I can't take your mother anymore," and hanging up, the phone just rang. The next day in school, I walked around the block several times before going inside. By the time I'd made it to class, I'd put out of my head what had occurred, as if the big event, the big show at the Garden, had not happened, and life goes on. But the other kids didn't. The first thing they asked me when I went to class was, "What happened at the Garden last night?" I had no answer, and they weren't having it. Finally, early in the day, I relented and told another kid that my fucking father didn't show up and called him a piece of shit. The whispers began. The taunts started. First in class and then into the lunchroom. "His father left him, ha ha. Doesn't your mother know who your real father is? Ha ha ha." Kids can be cruel. All I wanted to do was escape. Escape into the woods or some rich, privy neighborhood, someplace where it was quiet and not always too hot or too cold, where there was plenty to eat and the refrigerator was not bare except for baking soda, where these damn kids weren't. I didn't run home that day. I walked with my head down. I went inside. I was all alone as usual, the only one in the apartment. I turned on the TV. It was still on channel 18 on the dial, ESPN. The music played and the drop kicks and suplexes started. From the world-famous Sportatorium in Dallas, Texas, this is world-class championship wrestling. I pushed the power button in. The TV faded to black.
Next time on This Man's Amazing Life. Episode number 4. Benjamin talks about his mother taking him to Canada and his encounter with Sasquatch. He discusses learning how to read and his experiences with his grandparents. And he discusses the mole people who lived in the subway tunnels in New York. All of that and more on the next episode of This Man's Amazing Life.